Yeah. Good evening. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you very much. As director of the Institute of Politics here at the Harvard Kennedy School, I am delighted to welcome you to the JFK Junior Forum for a public address by the Right Honourable John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons. And this has been a very busy start to our forum season this semester. We've had an active schedule already with Congressman Will Hurd of Texas. We've had a fascinating conversation about athletics and activism with Clark Kellogg and former IOP fellow Brittany Packnett. And we've had a very rich discussion with our IOP resident fellows on the 2020 election and issues pressing both domestically and internationally. This Thursday, we'll host a forum entitled Hong Kong, the Future of One Country, Two Systems, with our colleague Tony Sage from the Ash Center, Jane Perlos, who's a Shorenstein Fellow and the Beijing New York Times Bureau Chief, and Victoria Tinborg-Huey, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. And this forum really has been, since 1978, an important place for honest dialogue and debate, informal remarks. It's been important for students and faculty and staff and community members to engage with those who take the stage, from heads of state to leaders of legislative bodies to journalists, activists, and others from across the globe. And one of the great traditions of the forum is that every speaker has to submit to questions from the audience, from students and others. Our own question and answer period. And so around the room you will see microphones, and at the conclusion of the talk, my colleague Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook will moderate the question and answer period. Catherine, of course, is the executive director of the Project on Europe and Transatlantic Relationships. But tonight we welcome the Right Honourable John Bercow, and it's my pleasure to introduce him, a well-known figure in UK politics. He's been the Speaker, the Commons Speaker since 2009, and I think it's fair to say that this is a parliamentary speaker who has a worldwide audience. He is certainly the most visible and certainly the most viral speaker in a generation. As he manages the Prime Minister's question and answer period with shouts of well, you have some competition here. Welcome to Harvard. He is the first Commons Speaker since World War II to have served along 4 prime ministers, and he himself has been elected to his leadership post 4 times. He is not reluctant to exercise his power from the chair by wielding power with authority during these uncertain times, and certainly with Brexit. He's championed the rights of the backbenchers, with granting more than 650 urgent questions from MPs, more than any other speaker, to bring, in his view, ministers to account for pressing issues of the day. So please join me in welcoming to the Kennedy School, to Harvard University, for his first appearance here in the forum, the Right Honourable John Bercow.
Mark, thank you. Bless you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Order! Order! Mark, thank you for the warmth and generosity of that welcome, to which I don't know, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, whether I'm entirely equal, but I shall strive to do my level best, not to disappoint. Perhaps I can begin by saying that, having heard myself introduced, I can hardly wait to hear myself speak. Whether you'll feel the same way at the end of my remarks is a matter for legitimate speculation and conjecture, but it seems apposite to begin by asking, can you hear me at the back and on the top? Well, I want to thank you for that answer, which was of crystal clarity in the affirmative, and which marks, if I may say so, and I do, a notable improvement upon the last occasion that I posed that question outside of the United States. Can you hear me at the back? To an audience in which some unhelpful wag replied, yes, but I'll happily change places with someone who can't. So, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that you can hear me and that you appear not altogether distraught about that fact is the source of modest succor and encouragement to me as I begin. Mark, of course, has a track record of public service and of academic and professional leadership, which speaks for itself. I have, in fact, this evening on meeting him and shaking hands, dubbed him the intellectual Gandalf of the Harvard Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics. It is the most enormous pleasure, privilege, and honor to be invited to speak to this gathering, and I made my views on that matter very clear to Catherine as well. Now, you may say, oh, well, John's just paying obeisance to the protocol. He's just observing the niceties. He thinks it's the courteous thing to do to say thank you, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. And of course, to an extent, that is what you would expect a visiting speaker to do. But it goes deeper than that. I have long admired Harvard University as a whole, and the Kennedy School of Government and the Institute of Politics in particular. It seems to me that Harvard University is synonymous with the exploration and interplay of ideas on a scale unsurpassed by any academic institution anywhere in the world known to me. So for those of you who study here, you must be suffused with pride at how fortunate you are, what opportunities it presents, how you can gain both in the short as well as in the medium and long term from the experience of being taught here, self-studying here, interacting with others here, and benefiting from the truly global esteem in which this magnificent university is held. I am thrilled to be here beyond words. Before I say anything that treats of my responsibilities, I am, however, conscious of one quite sensitive matter which your natural courtesy may disincline you to raise with me directly, but which, if unaddressed, will lurk, potentially from my vantage point, perilously in the undergrowth, and which I conclude, therefore, should be knocked on the head at the outset. And that is the delicate and sensitive matter of height. Very specifically, it has been bruited in some of the more down-market parts of the media that I'm the shortest man ever to be Speaker of the UK House of Commons. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to assure you, with all the force and rhetorical insistence at my command, that there's nothing wrong with being short. I say to those who share that characteristic of vertical challenge with me, we short people should stick together. We may be short, but we may also be perfectly formed. We're assuredly environmentally friendly because we don't take up much space. And in any case, we have to make a virtue of necessity, and I do. I've always been short. I'm now 56 years old, and I remain short, and given the known impact of the aging process upon physiognomy, the overwhelming likelihood is that I shall become inexorably and irrevocably shorter still. And about the fact of that continued and soon to be exacerbated shortness, I'm as intensely relaxed as Peter Mandelson, Doyen of New Labour, Svengali of the Third Way. once said that New Labour was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. But I'm not intensely relaxed about the matter of historical accuracy. You'd expect the Speaker, forsooth, to have done his research. If in no other respect, I hope at least in that respect not to disappoint you, I have done. And it's quite wrong when some of these more down-market, low-music-hall, fifth-rate scribblers say, oh, well, Bercow's the shortest man ever to be Speaker of the UK House of Commons. Quite wrong. Sir John Bussey, Speaker of the UK House of Commons, from 1394 to 1398. Sir John Wenlock, Speaker of the UK House of Commons, from 1455 to 1456. And Sir Thomas Tresham, Speaker of the UK House of Commons, in 1459, are all believed to have been shorter than I am, although I do have to admit that this was true only after all three of them had been beheaded. Indeed, no fewer than 7 of my predecessors met their end on the executioner's block. One was killed in battle, and a further poor unfortunate soul was brutally murdered. So you will understand that this does enable me to view the woes and challenges which afflict and confront the House of Commons, and which in all candour periodically afflict and confront me, with an appropriate sense of historical perspective. That is to say, whatever else happens to me, I am not likely to lose my head, though there may be some who wish to contradict that proposition because they have plans of which I know nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great joy to be here, and I want, if I may, to make 3 key points to you. First, and it relates to the best known and most visible function of the Speaker of the House. The primary duty of the Speaker of the House of Commons is to chair in the chamber, chair question times, Prime Ministers and other ministerial question times, chair the delivery of government statements and questioning thereon, chair key debates in Parliament. In that capacity, the first essential prerequisite is for the Speaker to have a decent memory. The Speaker is obliged to know who all 649 other members are, of which parties they're members, which constituencies they represent in the House, and on key issues, not on the vast miscellany of political topics, but on key issues where members stand. So if you take Brexit or Israel-Palestine, it's up to me to have a sense of their vantage point, not because I'm seeking to censor, but because I'm seeking to facilitate the fullest and fairest expression of opinion which exists in the House. The Speaker in our system, by contrast with that of others, including that of your own magnificent legislature, the key responsibility of the Speaker is to be an umpire or a referee rather than a player on the pitch. My job is to try to ensure that all the different voices are heard, the nuances of argument are explored, that I exercise my discretion to select new clauses to legislation and amendments both to legislation and to motions in order to tease out the key issues and allow, if you will, the democratic appetite of the House of Commons to be satisfied. Your own magnificent Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, has a different role, and of course one readily understands that the role is much more party political in the United States. I seek to discharge my responsibilities by ensuring that I know who everybody is, that I'm focused on the subject matter at hand, that I'm aware of the range of issues potentially to be explored in debate and by separate division or vote, and that everybody gets a fair opportunity. Can I please everybody? Oh, come, 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 illustrious and cerebral glitterati of Harvard University. What are those pigs I see flying in front of my very eyes? It is completely impossible to satisfy everybody. There will always be a colleague who is completely convinced that there is no debate that would not be improved by a contribution from him. or her of quite stunning erudition and probably of comparable length, and who cannot understand why the opportunity to speak that day has not been afforded by the chair. The reality, of course, is that there is the ever-present, the unfailing, the never-disappearing constraint of time, and you can simply do your best. And I think if you satisfy most people most of the time, that is as much as you can realistically hope to accomplish. So that is the first and foremost, the without which nothing function of the Speaker of the House of Commons: to be the referee, to be the umpire, and knowing who everybody is and showing reasonable physical stamina. My longest stint in the chair in my tenure has been 14 hours without a break, and decent levels of concentration out of respect for individual members and for the House as an institution. However, the second point I want to make to you is that although at various times in our parliamentary and political history, that has been all that was requested of the Speaker of the House, it has been context dependent. And when I stood for election, as Mark rightly observed, in the summer of 2009, there was an atmosphere of expectation of, and almost I would say clamour for, change within the institution of the House of Commons. To wit, people felt that Parliament had to change. And my own proposition to my colleagues in seeking election against 9 other candidates at that time was that over a period of decades, under governments of both complexions, of right and left, including periods of pacts with other parties, there had been one recurrent theme, one constant. And that recurrent theme or constant was that the power of government had increased and was continuing to increase, and in my judgment it needed to be either reduced or checked. Of which, my friends, the corollary that I also put to colleagues was that the power of Parliament over that period of probably 4 decades had decreased, was continuing to decrease, and needed to be increased. So I said, look, if you elect me, I will try for a start to speed up question time and to ensure that we get through more, because progress is rather lethargic. And what has happened is that people who serve as members of Parliament have given up on the chamber. They despair of getting called to ask a question if they're at number 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 on the order paper, the list of potential questions for the day. Instead, they go off and they write a blog, or they do a radio interview, or they turn up in a television studio. And the life is being sapped from the chamber of the House of Commons, the principal part and the elected part, the democratic part of the legislature of the United Kingdom. That's got to change. So I've tried to speed up question time, and simply as a matter of fact, we do get through a lot more questions now than we used to do. But very specifically, I identified a series of changes which, with the support and collaboration of the House, I would want to see take root in our proceedings and affairs. And in the time available, I'd like to highlight one to which Mark, in his generous introduction, alluded. I said, colleagues, I think too often there's a mismatch between what we're debating and what the public are thinking, what we're arguing about and what preoccupies them, what we're voting on and what they think we should be debating or voting upon in the House of Commons. What we need to do is to revive urgency and topicality. And so I said, look, if you elect me as Speaker, I want to revive the mechanism or the instrument of the urgent question, capital U, capital Q, for which there has been long-standing provision in our standing orders, but which has fallen into desuetude in recent years. In the year before I was elected Speaker, 2 urgent questions were granted by the Speaker, because they are applied for to the Speaker, and granted or not granted by the Speaker. In my first year, we had 24. We have had 658 over the last decade. And the reason why I wanted to make that change was that I thought it will bring colleagues back into the chamber. It will be an enabling, a revitalizing, a stimulating force for members who want to question, to probe, to scrutinize, to challenge, perhaps to contradict, or to expose the errors of omission or commission of the government of the day. So it will be a real opportunity for the legislature, and correspondingly, it will hold ministerial feet to the fire, requiring ministers, whatever else they're doing, to come to the chamber for a specified period of at least 20 minutes, but possibly 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55 minutes, an hour of sustained questioning. And that's what I have sought to do and have done with the support of colleagues. And of course, the climate of expectation has been such that far more people apply for urgent questions now because they know there's a decent chance of getting them. There have been other changes. Changes with the support of the House, which I, but many others, championed, to elect the chairs of the committees that scrutinize the executive branch, as opposed to the previous and extraordinary arrangement whereby the people who chaired the committees that scrutinized the executive were handpicked by representatives of that executive. Well, that's gone. We have elected select committee chairs and by party caucus elected members of select committees. We have a backbench business committee that chooses the business one day a week, typically 35 times a year. That business would not necessarily and ordinarily would not have been chosen by the government or even necessarily the official opposition. But it's what ordinary elected legislators and representatives of principles and of causes and of constituencies want to be on the agenda. So it's happened. We have elected deputy speakers. All of my 3 deputies are elected by secret ballot rather than appointed by the party whips. The party whips, on the whole, on both sides, were not wild keen on this democratic renaissance that has taken place at the behest of my colleagues with support from me. Why? Well, people who've got power, of course, want to keep it. When I was a backbencher and indeed an opposition spokesperson, I confess that I had a relationship with the whips characterized by trust and understanding. I didn't trust them and they didn't understand me. But far more members are backbenchers than front, not part of the ruling machine, but entitled, nay, obliged constitutionally to stand up for what they believe is right, to probe, to question, to explore, to check, to seek improvement. That is the function of a legislature. And I think that the other changes I've mentioned are very worthwhile and extremely important, and there's more to be done. I think we could reform the House further. I think we could deal with private members' legislation better. I think that we could have a trigger mechanism for the recall of Parliament which would not depend upon the government of the day, something for which I've argued for a long time but which has not happened. I would like government business, which they've a right to stage and to get through if they've got the votes, to be timetabled by a House, capital H, business, capital B, committee, capital C, rather than just determined behind closed doors by the government's representatives in consultation with, but in a very superior position to, representatives of the opposition. So there are lots of other reforms that could take place, but those reforms have been worthwhile. And I think that the urgent question reform has been probably the single biggest instrument of parliamentary scrutiny and empowerment over the last decade. Outside the chamber, I regarded it as a priority to try to modernize the parliamentary estate. The Speaker chairs the House of Commons Commission, which is the strategic governing body of the House. When I was elected, I thought it completely ridiculous that we got a shooting gallery on the parliamentary estate, but we had no nursery which MPs and staff could pay for to broker a better work-life balance. Well, 10 years later, I'm pleased to say we have a thriving, highly successful, extremely well-subscribed nursery on the parliamentary estate, and the shooting gallery has been closed down due to lack of demand. That is surely a very much more satisfactory distribution of priorities. I wanted to build not least having admired what's happened in Washington, an education centre analogous to a visitor centre in Parliament that would enable us to showcase what we've done over the centuries in Westminster and to draw in another 100,000 young people a year to come to Westminster to learn about the journey to the rights and representation that we enjoy today by comparison with where we started several hundred years ago. Well, we can't be accused of hurrying matters in Parliament. The digital, high-tech, cutting-edge, interactive, state-of-the-art facility called the Education Centre, which is adjacent to the House of Lords, was a project with the support of colleagues that I wanted to drive forward. And that facility was opened in 2015, in the year that we marked the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta and the 750th anniversary of the first recognisably English Parliament. So we cannot be accused of excessive haste. Treebeard from Lord of the Rings, who warned against excessive haste, would doubtless applaud the fact that we took so long. But I think we took far too long to build that facility, but thankfully we did. And another priority for me has been to try to promote diversity and inclusion on the parliamentary estate. We are home to debating chambers in Commons and Lords, but we're also a World Heritage Site. We are a supplier of services, and, ladies and gentlemen, we are a significant employer, and we owe a duty of care to those whom we employ and those who are not employed by but are contracted to work for Parliament and serve on the parliamentary estate. And for me, it's been a big mission to try to make the staff complement of the House look somewhat more like the country we're charged to represent. So I do take pride in the fact that I appointed the first female and BAME Speaker's Chaplain, the Right Reverend Rose Hudson Wilkin, in the history of the House of Commons, the warmest, most engaging and empathetic, inspiring Speaker's Chaplain anyone could want, who is about to become Bishop of Dover after a fantastic tenure in the service of the House. I appointed the first BAME Sergeant-at-Arms, Mohammed Kamal Al-Haji, in the history of the House, and I did appoint the first female and BAME Speaker's Counsel, senior lawyer in the House, in our history. There's a lot more to do. We need to learn. Advice must be sought, expert consultancy guidance on how best to recruit, to retain, to talent nurture and promote people across the piece. But we do need to make sure that we redouble our efforts and don't stand still. The last point I want to make to you is that I believe that alongside that first role of chairing in the chamber and that second role of acting as a facilitator of or a catalyst for necessary, desired and overdue change, there is there not, a role for the Speaker as ambassador for Parliament, an advocate of democratic politics more widely across the country and beyond. I have to be impartial within the chamber, but I don't have to be impartial about the chamber. And surely we have got to be intelligible to, and if possible, appreciated by the electorate that we serve. And that's why I said, well, if you elect me as Speaker, I intend to get out and about beyond the Palace of Westminster to visit schools and colleges and universities and faith groups and charitable institutions and public bodies to talk about the functions of the Speaker and the role of Parliament and the nature of our democracy, how it's changing, why it matters, in what way people can engage with us. And it is also why I resolved on day one that I would every year chair the UK Youth Parliament's annual sitting on the green leather benches on a non-sitting Friday in Westminster, which I've done since 2009. And I said to the UKYP, I'll come to your conference every year, not as a picket, not as an unwelcome blot on the horizon, but as a visitor to talk to and hear from you if you want. Now, why have I done that with the UK Youth Parliament? Well, the cynics amongst you would say, well, because, as my late father used to say, John, generally speaking, is generally speaking. And you'd be right, that's true. I enjoy it. I love communication. And I enjoy chairing those debates and going to their conference. But I do it for another reason, which I hope you will accept, and that is that I think that if we, in Parliament, want ever again to be respected by young people, we have to show respect for young people. Respect is not our automatic right, it is an earned credit, or if you will, a two-way street. And what better way to show one's support for and belief in the institution of the Youth Parliament than to devote the time and energy to attend to them and offer support for them. I hope I've given you a flavour of what I do. I haven't touched significantly on Brexit. It is not for me to implement Brexit or to stop Brexit. There are a number of possible outcomes of Brexit about which I think your insatiable appetite will be such that somebody will wish to probe me. But I have given you a sense of what it is I do, chairing in the chamber, trying to deliver a better, more modernised, reformed institution, and getting out and about, not incarcerated in the Palace of Westminster, dressed up in a fancy uniform and completely inaccessible to the outside world. People who hold important public offices, I'm not important at all, other than I hope to my wife and children, but the office of Speaker is important, and I think people who occupy important public offices have got to get out there and make the case, talk to, hear from, and engage with people. There can be literally, in university terms, no greater honour anywhere in the world than to be invited to appear before the JFK Junior Forum. I am thrilled, you can probably tell it, and you will now be relieved beyond words in view of your stoicism, fortitude, and forbearance to know that my speech is definitively at an end. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bless you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. I am Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook. I am the Executive Director of not only the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship, but also the Future of Diplomacy Project right here at the Belfer Center. And really nobody could have said it any better that what is said about this Speaker of the House of Commons is right. He is, in his role as protector of the realm, he is the majoritarian dictator, I think. The protector, the backbencher's backstop, the protector of the realm. So it is my role in 2 quick questions to filibuster, but I have very little time to have to do that because, as you can already see, people have lined up. We have 4 microphones. Please use them to your best advantage because we will use them to your best advantage. This is the JFK Jr. Forum, and with that come certain ground rules. The ground rules are as follows. Introduce yourself. Tell us why you're here. Keep your question to a question. No long speeches, please. Let your voice rise at the end so that we know that there's a question mark, and then we will turn it over to you. So I have only one question as we get this started, because you said that nothing at this point is off limits, and the thing that is burning under our fingernails is, of course, what will happen between now and October 31st. And as all of you students of the UK democracy will know, Parliament has the sovereignty, the ultimate sovereignty. And you have just heard why it is critical to protect it. But tomorrow, and that is an important moment, I think, in this constitutional crisis, the courts, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, will be coming together in an emergency session. In some regards, perhaps to take over that protective realm, because they will be deciding on whether or not the prorogation of Parliament, this 5-week break that you are now have been subjected to, is lawful or is in fact unlawful. So my question to you then is, in this interplay between critical institutions, the courts now coming to help democracy, how do you see this playing out? Is this an advantage? Does this help and strengthen faith in British democracy at this critical time where Brexit is upon us? Or is this in fact a show of weakness for British democracy?
I don't think it can ever be a weakness, Catherine. Thank you very much indeed. when there is, if you will, a backstop, a final arbiter, a decision-making mechanism. I think it would be a weakness if there were paralysis and no way of deciding, but that's not the situation. We have a prorogation of Parliament. You will be familiar with that fact. There have been many, many, many prorogations, but there is a considerable body of opinion that feels that this prorogation is different. I've expressed my views on that matter. It will be determined by the Supreme Court in the coming days. I think anybody who predicts, either with certainty or with complete confidence, what the outcome will be is either extraordinarily clever or a reckless fool. So I'm not going to predict what the outcome will be, because I simply don't know. What I do say is that there are 3 possible scenarios between now and the end of October. Either there is an approved Brexit deal, and we leave because Parliament has approved said deal. Alternatively, there is not an approved deal, because a deal that is put is rejected, but Parliament resolves that we shall nevertheless leave at the end of October. Mm-hmm. That's the second scenario, which is democratically legitimate. The third scenario is that Parliament decides that it wants further time, an extension of Article 50, as a route and in order to segue to a mechanism for making a decision. That Correct. Mechanism may be another election, or it could be another public vote in the form of a plebiscite. I'm not arguing for one or other of those 3. I'm simply saying that those are the scenarios. What seems to me, as Speaker, as a representative of Parliament, of critical importance is that what happens by way of decision must be the result of the explicit endorsement of the UK Parliament. We cannot elide into something by happenstance, by accident, by omission, by default. Parliament must come to a view, and any view to be legitimate has, in my judgment, to be authorised by Parliament, period.
Your word in God's ear, not the advice that Ian Duncan Smith gave the Prime Minister, as all of you will know, but we will certainly probe those questions a little bit more. You get the first question.
Thank you. My name is Todd Gillespie. I'm a student in GSAS. Much of the coverage of you in the US, as well as your speech and introduction this evening, has conveniently ignored the context of widespread bullying in the British Parliament, including allegations against yourself. I was wondering if you, apparently the protector, according to the moderator, had anything to say to the staffers who have endured a culture which Dame Laura Cox's report called a culture of subservience, acquiescence and silence, in which bullying, harassment and sexual harassment have long been tolerated and concealed, or indeed to Kate Ems, your former staffer, who was diagnosed with PTSD after 9 months of working for you.
No, I'm very happy to respond to that question. First of all, I have explicitly and publicly on several previous occasions made absolutely clear my utter rejection of any idea that we can tolerate bullying. Where we have failed, we've got to put matters right. I accepted on the floor of the House of Commons the recommendations of Dame Laura Cox. Parliament is implementing the recommendations of Dame Laura Cox, and it is doing so with my full and enthusiastic support. That is not a matter of opinion, but of record. You won't expect me, ladies and gentlemen, to address matters appertaining to particular individuals in a public forum, which would be completely unethical and improper. I have no intention of doing so. What I do say is that I totally, utterly refute any allegation against me of bullying. I have never bullied anyone, anywhere, in any way, at any time. What I have done is stand up for the rights of the House of Commons, champion the legislature, ensure that intimidation of those who want to speak their mind does not hold sway. And as far as staff is concerned, what I will say to you, sir, and it's a very legitimate question, is this. I wouldn't have, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, people who've worked in my office for the full decade of my tenure with total loyalty and commitment if I somehow maltreated my staff. I've never done so, I don't do so, and until my dying day, I will proclaim my commitment to and my record in the fair treatment of everybody who works with me or for me. That's my position. It's always been my position. It will remain my position. People can say what they like, but innocent until proven guilty. And I repeat, sir, for your benefit, I've never bullied anyone, anywhere, in any way, at any time. That has the advantage of being true. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm David Franklin. I'm a second-year MPA ID student here at Harvard. You spoke about your duty to be impartial in the House, but not about the House. When the business in the House is about the House, that would suggest that you could be faced with a paradox. Do you agree that there's a paradox there? And if so, how do you go about resolving it?
That is a very fair point. There can be a tension, and that's a typically Harvard sophisticated question, and one lays oneself open to that if one comes to Harvard University to speak. You have to use your judgment as to what is the best interest of the House. If I may say so, I think that the overriding expectation and indeed insistence on the part of the House over decades has been that the Speaker doesn't take sides in any party political sense. Manifestly, if there is an issue about is this the right way to treat the House or is that the right way to treat the House, and the Speaker is in some way either expected or almost required to take a view, well, taking a view means taking a view. It doesn't mean resolving not to take a view. As Churchill said, resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful to be impotent. Well, that's not much use in those circumstances, is it? You have to be prepared to take a position. So I have done, but that isn't the same as taking a party political view. It's a little bit like inviting visitors to the House, where the Speaker has a role. I won't dwell on that, but where the Speaker has got a role in such matters, should an invitation be issued or shouldn't it, you obviously cannot be impartial as between issuing an invitation and not issuing an invitation. If the House of Commons were not to want the Speaker to have a role in such matters, it would be perfectly legitimate for the House to say, well, we'd like this process to be dealt with in some other way. But if it is expected of and incumbent upon the Speaker to make the judgments, well, then the Speaker shouldn't duck the judgments. And I haven't walked away from the judgments. I've tried to make the right judgments, but I've made the judgments that I've made, not in furtherance of a party cause, but in furtherance or protection of the parliamentary cause.
We'll go up here, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Chiron Jr. I'm a student from Bentley University. So permit me, first of all, congratulate your government, and particularly the House of Commons, which you had a speaker for the great contribution in working with the government of Cameroon to come to a conclusion for a peace discussion. May I know what diplomatic measures your government is taking by itself and in collaboration with your international allies, such as France, Canada, and the United States, to ensure that the concept and processes of the projected dialogue are genuine and assurance of sustainable outcome through addressing the root cause of the problems?
Sir, that is an extraordinarily good, focused and lucidly delivered question, and I am pained to say this to you. But you know, politicians are always accused of either ducking a question or of pretending to know an answer when they don't. So I'm afraid I'm going to give you an answer that you won't like, but it is not meant in any respect discourteously. I haven't the foggiest idea on that matter at this moment, and although it is a very important matter, it doesn't, I'm afraid, relate to the responsibilities of the Speaker. So it's a very important question and it warrants further exploration, but Could I answer you, or should I answer you now on that point? The answer, I'm afraid, is no and no.
Politicians that are fundamentally honest, a rarity in these days. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Siddharth Srikanth. I'm a first-year MPP at the Kennedy School. So, Mr. Bercow, you said, I think 3 days ago, that Britain needs a written constitution, presumably because the current one is being tested to its limits by Brexit, but by other factors as well. But you've also said that, in the recent days, that you are willing to use procedural creativity to try and stop a no-deal Brexit. And equally, Boris Johnson's government and Theresa May's before him stressed the limits of Commons procedures and, frankly, the law to try and get their version of Brexit through. So do you risk, or have you already started an arms race between the Speaker and the government of the day, which risks spinning out of control and making the problem you described even worse? Or is there something fundamentally different about what the government's done that merits your response?
Thank you. First of all, I haven't stretched the limits of the law, sir. It's an extremely good and probing question. In any way, I've operated within the law and, in my judgment, within the existing procedures of the House of Commons. I don't want to cavil, but I floated the idea that it was time to consider the merits of a written constitution. I didn't say we must have such, but I certainly think that it would be timely, properly to explore those issues, either by a Royal Commission or a Speakers' Conference that would be chaired by my successor. It's not a power grab on my part. I've already announced that I'm intending to depart by the end of October. But it does seem to me that those issues lend themselves to very thorough, concentrated and expert study and reflection. In terms of the approach to the period ahead, I haven't said that I will use creativity to try to stop a no-deal Brexit. I understand that this is sometimes a shorthand that people use, but forgive me being pedantic, ladies and gentlemen, but I must make the point, I'm not trying to promote one outcome or another. What I'm seeking to ensure is that the outcome that is arrived at in the period ahead is the conscious choice, the explicit preference of Parliament, whatever it may be. And when you say, might I risk, in a sense, exacerbating a tension, I hope not. I think it is a fair point to say this. There are procedures that have not been very ambitiously used in the past, which are now ambitiously used in the present. The Standing Order 24 procedure to provide for emergency debates, and on 2 occasions in the last 6 months, the effective claim by a majority vote of the House of parliamentary time to allow someone other than the government to introduce and pilot through successfully legislation. I believe that hasn't involved any trickery or any abuse or any breaking or manipulation of rules. It has allowed their full use. That's the observation that I would make. And the related point I'd make is this. The government, of course, has a right to govern and to try to secure support for its legislation and its policies. However, it's no indictment of any individual. It's not a commentary on the Prime Minister or his predecessor or the Leader of the Opposition. This is a minority government. And if others in Parliament, aside from the representatives of the executive branch, want to put propositions to the House in pursuit of a majority, it is reasonable for the Speaker to take into account whether there is a body of opinion that wants something different from and in conflict with what the government wants. Now, in allowing those propositions by others to be put, I'm not siding against the government. What I'm doing is saying, let the will of the House be tested in an orderly and democratic way. That's what I've done. I accept that it may be disquieting to some people, but it has been done honestly. I think it's fair-minded, and in a number of cases when I have allowed that to happen, that challenger viewpoint in democratic terms has then prevailed in the vote. So it's not as though I've allowed something to happen, taking up a great deal of time for which there's no great support. I have allowed things to happen for which there is great and in many cases majority support.
Just one additional question there, because I liked the allusion to the question of speed, because we are in a race against the clock right now. In terms of parliamentary procedure, again, not to decide in either way, but we are in a race against the clock. So as we imagine this going on in the chambers, because arms race was mentioned, do we see your colleagues pilfering through the history of legal instruments to make this happen? Is this how we imagine people poring over how we might use the laws to create that continued birth for Parliament? Do you feel that that is going on because we are in this moment of extreme need for speed, frankly?
I do think speed is a huge factor. I think it's a combination, ladies and gentlemen, of the pressure of the clock on the one hand and the enormity of the subject matter on the other. And that combination is what is propelling colleagues, to be fair, on both sides of the argument, to ask themselves, well, what procedurally is possible and might we wisely do? And in each case, you know, it is for the chair, where the chair has an arbitrating or decision-making role, to come to a view as to whether what is requested or proposed is orderly or not. And I can't necessarily please everybody, but I'm trying to do the right thing and then leave the House to make the judgment that it will. But yes, time and the subject matter are really the motive forces in this.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'm Kevin, a student at MIT. This is a follow-up to the notion of written versus unwritten constitution raised. Is the Fixed Term Parliaments Act really to blame for the current Parliament's, being stuck in a gridlock, as it were? Why or why not?
The Fixed Term Parliament Act was introduced as part of the agreement between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats after the 2010 election. Prime Minister Cameron formed a coalition, not just a confidence and supply agreement, but a coalition with Nick Clegg's Liberal Democrats. And one part of their joint endeavours was to pass that act so that the Prime Minister would no longer be the exclusive arbiter of when an election should be called. There would be a fixed term. Is it to blame for the situation that we're in? I think that that does place far too great a weight on one piece in the jigsaw, if I can put it that way. There is no doubt, sir, that there are very different views about whether the Act, if it was ever justified, remains so, and there are quite a lot of people who think that it shouldn't remain, but there are people who think that it should. It is a factor, and it makes a difference to calculation, obviously, if a government cannot simply call an election when it wants. But if you're asking me, do I think overall, it is a major contributory factor to where we are in the Brexit debate, I would say no. We've had 3.25 years of debate since the referendum, and there are all sorts of factors involved. The 2017 loss of the Conservatives' majority was a factor. The government, under Theresa May and then under Boris Johnson, has taken a particular view as to what its negotiating posture should be. There have been differences of opinion about the customs union and the single market and a miscellany of other issues. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act is part of the constellation of issues, but I wouldn't say myself, when we come to look at the issue as a whole, that it's completely centre stage. No.
All right, over to you.
This is on. Awesome. Thank you. My name's Connor. I am a first year at the college. And I found it interesting how you spoke about the difference in models of speakership between the United States and the United Kingdom. And I'm curious, which model do you see as more productive for democratic discourse? That is, in your opinion, could the United States use a less partisan, more impartial institution of a speakership in these divisive times? Or alternatively, could the United Kingdom use a more political speaker to deal with the present challenges?
Peaceful coexistence between different forms is what I commend to you, sir. Let me say to you that it would be the height of discourtesy extraordinary presumption and almost rank would-be constitutional imperialism for some visiting Brit to deign to toddle along to the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School in front of such cerebral company and to say what the Americans should do in the running of their affairs. There are parts of the United States, I very greatly regret this, I must say, as a long-term abolitionist, but there are parts of the United States where the death penalty still applies. I would be taking very grave risks if I thought it was right to lecture you on what you should do in your polity, in your circumstances, and with your mores. And by the way, I happen to think that Speaker Pelosi is the most outstanding public servant. That is my honest view. She's been a good personal friend to me, and she's somebody I enormously admire. But no, I think we should do things our way in the UK, and you can do them your way in America. I'm often accused of pontificating about what we ought to do in the UK, but it really would be a case of rhetorical overreach to start issuing sermons to the House of Representatives, and I will not do so.
And yet your deductive qualities are full on and on point. So you heard the subtext that was made right there. Go ahead.
Hi, good evening, Mr. Speaker.
Please.
My name is Eli Harrison. I'm from Brandeis University. I'm a politics major there. Arguably, the biggest issue with Brexit, as to some believe, with the election of President Donald Trump, is not what has happened, but what hasn't happened during these periods, during this 3-year period. And so I'm wondering to you, what issue has suffered the most, be it domestic or international, in the vacuum of oxygen that Brexit has just consumed? What issue do you feel like you would really like to have seen debated much more so than it has been on the floor of the House of Commons?
Gosh, where do we start? It's 6:59. We are under the pressure of the clock. I would find it difficult to pick one issue. I'm sorry to duck it, but I think there are huge numbers of very important issues. I think there is the continued legislative drive against domestic violence, which is a big political issue, and I know that there are colleagues who want the government's intended legislation on that matter to be brought forward, and I'm sure the government would want to introduce it as soon as possible. I think that the challenge of climate change is an existential threat to all of our futures and could legitimately absorb more parliamentary time. I happen to think that the biggest moral imperative of our age is the necessary effort to try to alleviate the plight of the poorest people on the face of the planet, 1,000 million of whom don't live. They exist on less than $1 a day. Those are just some of the examples of issues for which we could have more time, were it not for the fact, and it is no one person or party's fault, I'm not blaming government or opposition, it's just a fact, that Brexit has dominated, to the detriment and sometimes almost to the complete exclusion of any other subject matter. But we have got to deal with the here and now, and even once we've dealt with the immediate legislative and political challenge of whether to conclude a withdrawal agreement, this issue will be with us in one form or another for a long time to come. The idea that it's a question of just sorting Brexit and then moving on is not the case. There will be a very, very long, substantial and detailed debate, absolutely properly, about the nature and configuration of our future relationships with our European partners and beyond. There will be trade issues and security issues and a vast miscellany of other issues to discuss, but we've got to try to ensure that there is bandwidth so that a representative democracy can treat of the full range of issues that naturally absorb the interest and attention and speak to the needs and ambitions of our people. So there is a hell of a lot to do. I'm sorry I can't pick one issue, but I have given you some examples of issues for which more time is needed.
You get the last question in this round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just building upon the transatlantic question asked down there. So in a country like America, Donald Trump, who has no executive experience, can run to be president and be elected president, while in the UK, Boris Johnson, riding on a populist wave, isn't able to deliver a no-deal Brexit, arguably. One of our professors here at Harvard, a professor of government, has analyzed that British democracy is in certain ways less directly democratic than other Western systems. It puts less power in the hands of voters and party grassroots, and more in the hands of party officials and institutional gatekeepers. Basically, the point being that the parties are stronger in the UK than they are in the USA. My question is, do you think that is a good system? Should we be aiming for a more open system? And what role do you think referenda can play in that in the future? Thank you.
And if I can just add to that to have you weigh in on what may happen in October if we get the project Reset the Clock. So if the Prime Minister is serious about wanting to die in a ditch before he asks for an extension, then people are playing through all sorts of innovations that could happen within the party system, including a national unity government, which would seem, for a bicameral system, quite the innovation at the heart of Parliament. So just as an addendum to that point.
I think parties are relatively strong in the UK, although I don't think you should overstate it, because I just want to throw back at you a counter proposition which isn't intended to rebut yours, but should be regarded as sitting at least alongside it, and it is this. People often talk about the career politician who just does what the party says, climbs the greasy pole, is persistently obedient in pursuit of career advantage or from loyalty. Well, actually, the incidence of intra-party rebellion, ladies and gentlemen, is much greater now than it was, for example, in the 1950s or 60s. And there was no golden age of Parliament. Sometimes it is suggested that there was a period in which sturdy men, and it was almost exclusively, indeed exclusively men, who came to Westminster to deliberate on the great issues of the day without fear or favour, simply on the basis of conscience and their dispassionate judgment of the public interest, and that today's lot are much inferior. That, frankly, has no historical evidence or reinforcement or basis whatsoever. The truth is, in centuries past, very large numbers of members of Parliament didn't come to Parliament at all, or they would come a small number of times a year, and they would be tending to their estates or practicing at the bar or in their city banks or whatever. Members are very, very, very devoted to the service of their constituents, their causes, and their country, and they really do apply themselves. But a lot more members vote against the party whip now than was the case in the past. And that often rather upsets the whips, but it does at least show that people are attending to the issues and making a wider judgment about where they think the public interest lies. More widely, I would say I think there's a really good time to look at the House's procedures, how we can strengthen the role of backbenchers, how we can give greater opportunities for the legislature to assert itself. There may be a good argument where there is ambiguity or unspecificity in our rules for greater clarity and increased specificity, so that there is almost a universal agreement as to what a particular rule or standing order or convention does permit or can require or indeed excludes. As far as referenda are concerned, I think that the likelihood is that the referendum will always be a part of a democracy's potential mechanisms for dispute resolution. I don't think that that will go away. And who knows whether there will or won't be another referendum in months or years to come. I don't know. But you won't be surprised to hear me say that we've had a referendum, we will have to reach a view about how we proceed in the light of it. But as a general principle, I am a passionate champion of representative democracy as a means by which to arrive at key decisions. The idea that more widely we should adopt a policy of plebiscitary democracy and have referenda on nuclear power and pensions policy and the approach to cutting the deficit or whatever is for the birds. People elect politicians to Parliament to make decisions, not to swerve around them. And so, that is, it seems to be the primary component part of our system. Representative democracy, people are representatives, not delegates. And as I said in the House the other day, I genuinely believe that the vast majority of my colleagues are motivated by their notion of the national interest, by their perception of the public good, and by their duty, not as delegates, but as representatives, to do what they believe is right for our country. That matters. It is precious, and we should not only preserve it, we should nurture it, we should cherish it, we should champion it.
That is, if I dare say, the perfect word on which to end. Speaker John Bercow's defense, vivid defense, and I think in front of this audience, particularly the undergraduates that are with us today, whom the IOP educates to be dedicated to public service, to run for office, to commit themselves to the importance of a life of a public servant. You have just heard from a consummate public servant, arguably, and I will stand by my first word, the protector of the UK Parliament, the protector of that innate sovereignty that, constitution or not, rests right at the heart of Westminster. Please join me in thanking John Bercow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well done.
I've so enjoyed it. I hope people did, but for me it was a great privilege and huge fun.
Same for us.
Catherine, bless you.
This audience doesn't have to